The Life Divine by Aurobindo. Chapter 7. The Ego and the Dualities. The soul, seated on the same tree of nature, is absorbed and deluded and has sorrow because it is not the Lord. But when it sees and is in union with that other self and greatness of it, which is the Lord, then sorrow passes away from it. Svetasvatara Upanishad. If all is in truth Satchidananda, death, suffering, evil, limitation can only be the creation's positive in practical effect, negative in essence, of a distorting consciousness which has fallen from the total and unifying knowledge of itself into some error of division and partial experience. This is the fall of man, typified in the poetic parable of the Hebrew Genesis. That fall is his deviation from the full and pure acceptance of God and himself, or rather of God in himself, into a dividing consciousness which brings with it all the train of the dualities, life and death, good and evil, joy and pain, completeness and want, the fruit of a divided being. This is the fruit which Adam and Eve, Purusha and Prakriti, the soul tempted by nature, have eaten. The redemption comes by the recovery of the universal in the individual, and of the spiritual term in the physical consciousness. Then alone the soul in nature can be allowed to partake of the fruit of the tree of life, and be as the divine and live forever. For then only can the purpose of its descent into material consciousness be accomplished. When the knowledge of good and evil, joy and suffering, life and death has been accomplished through the recovery by the human soul of a higher knowledge which reconciles and identifies these opposites in the universal and transforms their divisions into the image of the divine unity. To Satchidananda, extended in all things, in widest commonality and impartial universality. Death, suffering, evil and limitation can only be at the most reverse terms, shadow forms of their luminous opposites. As these things are felt by us, they are notes of a discord. They formulate separation where there should be a unity, miscomprehension where there should be an understanding, an attempt to arrive at independent harmonies where there should be a self-adaptation to the orchestral whole. All totality, even if it be only in one scheme of the universal vibrations, even if it be only a totality of the physical consciousness without possession of all that is in movement beyond and behind, must be to that extent a reversion to harmony and a reconciliation of jarring opposites. On the other hand, to Satchidananda, transcendent of the forms of the universe, the dual terms themselves, even so understood, can no longer be justly applicable. Transcendence transfigures. It does not reconcile, but rather transmutes opposites into something surpassing them that effaces their oppositions. At first, however, we must strive to relate the individual again to the harmony of the totality. There it is necessary for us, otherwise there is no issue from the problem, to realize that the terms in which our present consciousness renders the values of the universe, though practically justified for the purposes of human experience and progress, are not the sole terms in which it is possible to render them, and may not be the complete, the right, the ultimate formulas. Just as there may be sense organs or formations of sense capacity which see the physical world differently, and it may well be better because more completely than our sense organs and sense capacity, so there may be other mental and supramental envisagings of the universe which surpass our own. States of consciousness there are in which death is only a change in immortal life, pain a violent backwash of the waters of universal delight, limitation a a turning of the infinite upon itself. Evil, a circling of the good around its own perfection. And this not in abstract conception only, but in actual vision and in constant and substantial experience. To arrive at such states of consciousness may, for the individual, be one of the most important and indispensable steps of his progress towards self-perfection. Certainly, the practical values given us by our senses and by the dualistic sense mind must hold good in their field and be accepted as the standard for ordinary life experience until a larger harmony is ready, into which they can enter and transform themselves without losing hold of the realities which they represent. To enlarge the sense faculties without the knowledge that would give the old sense values their right interpretation from the new standpoint might lead to serious disorders and incapacities, might unfit for practical life and for the orderly and disciplined use of the reason. Equally, an enlargement of our mental consciousness out of the experience of the egoistic dualities into an unregulated unity with some form of total consciousness might easily bring about a confusion and incapacity for the active life of humanity in the established order of the world's relativities. This, no doubt, is the root of the injunction imposed in the Gita on the man who has the knowledge not to disturb the life basis and thought basis of the ignorant. For, impelled by his example, but unable to comprehend the principle of his action, they would lose their own system of values without arriving at a higher foundation. Such a disorder and incapacity may be accepted personally and are accepted by many great souls as a temporary passage or as the price to be paid for the entry into a wider existence. But the right goal of human progress must be always an effective and synthetic reinterpretation by which the law of that wider existence may be represented in a new order of truths and in a more just and puissant working of the faculties on the life material of the universe. For the senses, the sun goes round the earth. that was for them the center of existence. And the motions of life are arranged on the basis of a misconception. The truth is the very opposite, but its discovery would have been of little use if there were not a science that makes the new conception the center of a reasoned and ordered knowledge, putting their right values on the perceptions of the senses. So also for the mental consciousness, God moves round the personal ego, and all his works and ways are brought to the judgment of our egoistic sensations, emotions, and conceptions, and are there given values and interpretations which, though a perversion and inversion of the truth of things, are yet useful and practically sufficient in a certain development of human life and progress. They are a rough, practical systematization of our experience of things, valid so long as we dwell in a certain order of ideas and activities. But they do not represent the last and highest state of human life and knowledge. Truth is the path, and not the falsehood. The truth is not that God moves round the ego as the center of existence, and can be judged by the ego and its view of the dualities, but that the divine is itself the center, and that the experience of the individual only finds its own true truth when it is known in the terms of the universal and the transcendent. Nevertheless, to substitute this conception for the egoistic without an adequate base of knowledge may lead to the substitution of new but still false and arbitrary ideas for the old, and bring about a violent instead of a settled disorder of right values. Such a disorder often marks the inception of new philosophies and religions, and initiates useful revolutions. But the true goal is only reached when we can group round the right central conception a reasoned and effective knowledge, in which the egoistic life shall rediscover all its values, transformed and corrected. Then we shall possess that new order of truths, which will make it possible for us to substitute a more divine life for the existence which we now lead, and to effectualize a more divine and puissant use of our faculties on the life material of the universe. That new life and power of the human integer must necessarily repose on a realization of the great verities which translate into our mode of conceiving things the nature of the divine existence. It must proceed through a renunciation by the ego of its false standpoint and false certainties, through its entry into a right relation and harmony with the totalities of which it forms a part, and with the transcendences from which it is a descent, and through its perfect self-opening to a truth and a law that exceed its own conventions, a truth that shall be its fulfillment, and a law that shall be its deliverance. Its goal must be the abolition of those values which are the creations of the egoistic view of things. Its crown must be the transcendence of limitation, ignorance, death, suffering, and evil. The transcendence, the abolition, are not possible here on earth and in our human life if the terms of that life are necessarily bound to our present egoistic valuations. If life is in its nature individual phenomenon, and not representation of a universal existence and the breathing of a mighty life spirit, if the dualities, which are the response of the individual to its contacts, are not merely a response, but the very essence and condition of all living, if limitation is the inalienable nature of the substance of which our mind and body are formed, disintegration of death, the first and last condition of all life, its end and its beginning, pleasure and pain, the inseparable dual stuff of all sensation, joy and grief, the necessary light and shade of all emotion, truth and error, the two poles between which all knowledge must eternally move. Then transcendence is only attainable by the abandonment of human life in a nirvana beyond all existence, or by attainment to another world, a heaven quite otherwise constituted than this material universe. It is not very easy for the customary mind of man, always attached to its past and present associations, to conceive of an existence still human, yet radically changed in what are now our fixed circumstances. We are, in respect to our possible higher evolution, much in the position of the original ape of the Darwinian theory. It would have been impossible for that ape leading his instinctive arboreal life in primeval forests to conceive that there would be one day an animal on the earth who would use a new faculty called reason upon the materials of his inner and outer existence, who would dominate by that power his instincts and habits, change the circumstances of his physical life, build for himself houses of stone, manipulate nature's forces, sail the seas, ride the air, develop codes of conduct, evolve conscious methods for his mental and spiritual development. And if such a conception had been possible for the ape mind, it would still have been difficult for him to imagine that by any progress of nature or long effort of will and tendency, he himself could develop into that animal. Man, because he has acquired reason, and still more because he has indulged his power of imagination and intuition, is able to conceive an existence higher than his own, and even to envisage his personal elevation beyond his present state into that existence. His idea of the supreme state is an absolute of all that is positive to his own concepts and desirable to his own instinctive aspiration. Knowledge without its negative shadow of error, bliss without its negation in experience of suffering, power without its constant denial by incapacity, purity and plenitude of being without the opposing sense of defect and limitation. It is so that he conceives his gods. It is so that he constructs his heavens. But it is not so that his reason conceives of a possible earth and a possible humanity. His dream of God and heaven is really a dream of his own perfection. But he finds the same difficulty in accepting its practical realization here for his ultimate aim, as would the ancestral ape if called upon to believe in himself as the future man. His imagination, his religious aspirations may hold that end before him. But when his reason asserts itself, rejecting imagination and transcendent intuition, he puts it by as a brilliant superstition, contrary to the hard facts of the material universe. It becomes then only his inspiring vision of the impossible. All that is possible is a conditioned, limited, and precarious knowledge, happiness, power, and good. Yet, in the principle of reason itself, there is the assertion of a transcendence. For reason is in its whole aim and essence the pursuit of knowledge. The pursuit, that is to say, of truth by the elimination of error. Its view, its aim, is not that of a passage from a greater to a lesser error, but it supposes a positive, pre-existent truth towards which, through the dualities of right knowledge and wrong knowledge, we can progressively move. If our reason has not the same instinctive certitude with regard to the other aspirations of humanity, it is because it lacks the same essential illumination inherent in its own positive activity. We can just conceive of a positive or absolute realization of happiness, because the heart to which that instinct for happiness belongs has its own form of certitude, is capable of faith. And because our minds can envisage the elimination of unsatisfied want, which is the apparent cause of suffering. But how shall we conceive of the elimination of pain from nervous sensation, or of death from the life of the body? Yet the rejection of pain is a sovereign instinct of the sensations. The rejection of death, a dominant claim inherent in the essence of our vitality. But these things present themselves to our reason as instinctive aspirations, not as realizable potentialities. Yet the same law should hold throughout. The error of the practical reason is an excessive subjection to the apparent fact which it can immediately feel as real, and an insufficient courage in carrying profounder facts of potentiality to their logical conclusion. What is the realization of an anterior potentiality. Present potentiality is a clue to future realization. And here potentiality exists. For the mastery of phenomena depends upon a knowledge of their causes and processes. And if we know the causes of error, sorrow, pain, death, we may labor with some hope towards their elimination. For knowledge is power and mastery. In fact, we do pursue as an ideal, so far as we may, the elimination of all these negative or adverse phenomena. We seek constantly to minimize the causes of error, pain, and suffering. Science, as its knowledge increases, dreams of regulating birth and of indefinitely prolonging life, if not of effecting the entire conquest of death. But because we envisage only external or secondary causes, we can only think of removing them to a distance, and not of eliminating the actual roots of that against which we struggle. And we are thus limited because we strive towards secondary perceptions and not towards root knowledge, because we know processes of things but not their essence. We thus arrive at a more powerful manipulation of circumstances, but not at essential control. But if we could grasp the essential nature and the essential cause of error, suffering, and death, we might hope to arrive at a mastery over them which should not be relative but entire. We might hope even to eliminate them altogether and justify the dominant instinct of our nature by the conquest of that absolute good, bliss, knowledge, and immortality, which our intuitions perceive as the true and ultimate condition of the human being. The ancient Vedanta presents us with such a solution in the conception and experience of Brahman as the one universal and essential fact, and of the nature of Brahman as Satchidananda. In this view, the essence of all life is the movement of a universal and immortal existence. The essence of all sensation and emotion is the play of a universal and self-existent delight in being. The essence of all thought and perception is the radiation of a universal and all-pervading truth. The essence of all activity is the progression of a universal and self-effecting good. But the play and movement embodies itself in a multiplicity of forms, a variation of tendencies, an interplay of energies. Multiplicity permits of the interference of a determinative and temporarily deformative factor, the individual ego. And the nature of the ego is a self-limitation of consciousness by a willed ignorance of the rest of its play and its exclusive absorption in one form, one combination of tendencies, one field of the movement of energies. Ego is the factor which determines the reactions of error, sorrow, pain, evil, death. For it gives these values to movements which would otherwise be represented in their right relation to the one existence, bliss, truth, and good. By recovering the right relation, we may eliminate the ego-determined reactions, reducing them eventually to their true values. And this recovery can be effected by the right participation of the individual in the consciousness of the totality and in the consciousness of the transcendent which the totality represents. Into later Vedanta, there crept and arrived at fixity the idea that the limited ego is not only the cause of the dualities, but the essential condition for the existence of the universe. By getting rid of the ignorance of the ego and its resultant limitations, we do indeed eliminate the dualities, but we eliminate along with them our existence in the cosmic movement. Thus we return to the essentially evil and illusory nature of human existence and the vanity of all effort after perfection in the life of the world. A relative good linked always to its opposite is all that here we can seek. But if we adhere to the larger and profounder idea that the ego is only an intermediate representation of something beyond itself, we escape from this consequence and are able to apply Vedanta to fulfillment of life and not only to the escape from life. The essential cause and condition of universal existence is the Lord, Ishvara or Purusha, manifesting and occupying individual and universal forms. The limited ego is only an intermediate phenomenon of consciousness necessary for a certain line of development. Following this line, the individual can arrive at that which is beyond himself, that which he represents, and can yet continue to represent it, no longer as an obscured and limited ego, but as a center of the divine and of the universal consciousness, embracing, utilizing, and transforming into harmony with the divine all individual determinations. We have then the manifestation of the divine conscious being in the totality of physical nature as the foundation of human existence in the material universe. We have the emergence of that conscious being in an involved and inevitably evolving life, mind, and supermind as the condition of our activities. For it is this evolution which has enabled man to appear in matter, and it is this evolution which will enable him progressively to manifest God in the body, the universal incarnation. We have in egoistic formation the intermediate and decisive factor which allows the one to emerge as the conscious many out of that indeterminate totality, general, obscure, and formless, which we call the subconscient. Hridaya Samudra, the ocean heart in things of the Rig Veda. We have the dualities of life and death, joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, truth and error, good and evil, as the first formations of egoistic consciousness. The natural and inevitable outcome of its attempt to realize unity in an artificial construction of itself, exclusive of the total truth, good, life, and delight of being in the universe. We have the dissolution of this egoistic construction by the self-opening of the individual to the universe and to God, as the means of that supreme fulfillment to which egoistic life is only a prelude, even as animal life was only a prelude to the human. We have the realization of the all in the individual by the transformation of the limited ego into a conscious center of the divine unity and freedom, as the term at which the fulfillment arrives. And we have the outflowing of the infinite and absolute existence, truth, good, and delight of being on the many in the world as the divine result towards which the cycles of our evolution move. This is the supreme birth which maternal nature holds in herself. Of this she strives to be delivered.